Welcome to the Dragon Fruit Podcast, a podcast where we reflect on the history of trans and queer Asian and Pacific Islander organizing, get into some juicy conversations about love and connection, and reclaim space for our own stories. This episode is produced by members of API Equality Northern California, also known as APINC, a grassroots organization that builds trans and queer Asian and Pacific Islander power to amplify our voices and increase the visibility of our communities.
My name is
Hi, my name is
Aloe. My pronouns are they, them, and I've been a volunteer with APINC since 2016. I'm excited to be your narrator for this episode. You'll be hearing my voice as the narrator, as well as the voices of the individuals we invited to be part of this podcast. Throughout this episode, we'll be in dialogue with each other. Before we get started, I want to give a content warning, as we will be mentioning issues of homophobia, transphobia, and anti-blackness throughout this episode. We will also provide a gentle reminder before each section, so you may skip certain parts if you'd like. As we reflect on our past, present, and future histories, we want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are writing, producing, and recording this podcast on stolen, unceded Ohlone land. We want to ask our non-Indigenous listeners to contribute to the Shumi land tax, which goes towards the Segorte Land Trust work of rematriation of Ohlone people's land. Since many of the folks we spoke to came into community through movement work, we wanted to understand how organizing has shaped their lives. So for this podcast, we brought together 30 plus people for these conversations, and we asked a common question. Over the last 5 years, what changes in movement work have you encountered, experienced, or observed? But we need to backtrack just a little, because what does movement work even mean? Everyone has their own definition, and we want to ground this podcast with a nuanced definition of movement work. So we're turning to Mika Hernandez, a mixed, queer, non-binary artist, community organizer, cook, and healer, born and raised on occupied Chochenyo Ohlone land. We wanted to ask Mika their perspective because of their extensive involvement with various organizing spaces, not just with APINC, but with Asians for Black Lives and the Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective.
Yeah, movement is such a tricky word, and I would hope that when I talk about movements, it's something that is coherent and legible to a lot of people, but to presume that we're all on the same page is not correct. And so I really appreciate the opportunity to get clear about it. And I think that we do, I don't know if I would think of a QTAPI movement, but at the same time, when I think about the formation that we both organize with Asians for Black Lives, right? We're Asians and we are mostly queer, a lot of trans GNC folks. And does that inherently make that a QTAPI movement, or just on a that's an interesting thing. And I think I've even just anecdotally named that to people before, that I'm it's just interesting that a lot of the people who show up to talk about abolition and the people who show up to talk about, I don't know, whatever that feels important and compelling to me, I often am finding queers wherever I go. And I think that that's really beautiful. And at the same time, there's this whole piece that just because we quote unquote share an identity, whatever those identities are, it does not mean that we automatically have alignment. So it's this overarching question that I always have. And I think that no matter what, when I come to movement, the thing that matters the most is alignment around values and having explicit conversations with one another about how our identities may have politicized us and how we come to the things that we come to and why we come to the things that we come to. And I think that allows for more space and more nuance. And I think something that has been hard for me has been trying to enter certain ethnic identity organizing spaces or cultural community spaces that are generally left, and feeling like my experiences as a mixed and fourth generation person are not like right, or are not as fill in the blank identity as everyone else is. And I know that that's not true, but it has felt that way sometimes. I have to prove how, for instance, how Korean I am or something like that. But I think that's something that I've always appreciated and have begun to share a lot over the years when I talk about my organizing with Asians for Black Lives, is that I think that Pan-Asian and Pan-API space has allowed me, at least in my experiences and the people that I've come across, more openness and more ability to come with the fullness of our stories. I'm not like automatically thinking, this is how you live your Asianness, because all of our Asianness is different, because we are a Pan-Asian space and Asians for Black Lives. I've been able to just hear stories about who and how a person is and who their people are and their ancestors. And so like openness to tell our stories and talking about our values are the things that define movement space that I really want to be in.
As Mika has alluded to, we are seeking the fullness of our stories as we define what movement work means to us. Throughout this podcast, we will be turning to our storytellers to share about themselves, their ancestors, and their movement work journeys. Advocacy work during the HIV/AIDS epidemic was pivotal to many of our storytellers' experiences. To understand why, we need to go back to the 1980s.
The truth about AIDS, the plague of the 80s.
HIV/AIDS highlighted the deep disparities amongst those who survived and those whom we lost. Especially in communities of color, those at risk of contracting HIV/AIDS face huge barriers to receive adequate and affordable health care. In our Asian communities, the topic of HIV/AIDS was coupled with cultural stigma and shame due to the lack of understanding around homosexuality and substance abuse. The knowledge of culturally competent healthcare was curated by queer and trans activists who fought for their people during a time of state discrimination. They pushed for national and global understandings of HIV/AIDS during a time of great uncertainty. It was during this period of time that Steve Liu and Vince Crisostomo, longtime organizers for the QTAPI community, first met each other. In 1989, Steve, a young bespectacled organizer, co-founded the GAPA Community HIV Project. Pronounced GCHIP, GAPA Community HIV Project was the first organization in the country to provide a spectrum of culturally appropriate direct services for Asians and Pacific Islanders living with AIDS and HIV. Vince, a gay Chamorro activist, joined GCHIP as an HIV/AIDS educator. At the height of the AIDS epidemic in San Francisco, Steve and Vince built a lifelong friendship, where to this day, they are still intricately connected by the various experiences and spaces that they share now.
For me, the work, I work mostly with the mainstream in my day job, and I've actually found that I've needed to come back to our queer trans API community to kind of refreshen myself, like rejuvenate and kind of draw perspective. And what I see and feel is that within our API, queer trans API community, there seems to be more of an openness for the generations to work together. I've kind of had to put myself in a place where I was willing to learn. And one of those is learning to ask for help, and also taking this time to kind of transform my relationships with some of the elder activists from our community. And I think it's what has been validated for me is that no matter what you think you're doing, and no matter how how I might question, is this effective or whatever, that whatever we're doing, that there's always progress. There is some progress, and sometimes lots of progress. And sometimes you can get in the way of your own progress. So, yeah, for me, it's just, I don't find it as stressful as I used to find it working in the 90s.
Yeah, when things you said, Vince, about progress, it makes me think of kind of thinking back on like change processes. A lot of it for me was about like what positions we each had or things like that. And I feel like there's more listening now and really trying to understand each other from like our personal and life experiences, but then trying to put in the context of everything else versus just like, what do you stand for? And then this is what I stand for. So that's what I feel like in our relationships over time, that it just has felt much more like trying to value our life experiences more in the context of where we stand.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Steve. I mean, and even just, I think you and I, our relationship, over the last couple of years, I've known you for like 30 years, but I feel like it's just the last couple of years that I really got to know you, because we didn't have that whole work thing.
Yeah.
And I think we actually are doing things that we want to do as opposed to things that we were paid to do. I don't know if that makes sense. But I've also found it's like, oh my God, it's there was some disconnects around, this is what we're paid to do, but this is what we should be doing. And I've actually been very grateful to our work with APINC in helping me to find that perspective.
Yeah. Well, we met each other during a time when there was both the unpaid work of really trying to just figure out how to organize ourselves when HIV, there were so many unknowns, and there certainly wasn't resources other than ourselves, like at that time. So there was like all this, what I remember experiencing, like us coming together out of needs and things, and then suddenly being in a situation where we had funding and we were working on different things that were within these constraints that got defined around units of service and how many educational trainings did you do with how many people and what kind of people. So somewhere in there, I always felt like, you were such a creative anyway. Whenever, we had like service deliverables and stuff, you were still able to kind of think about, well, let's do it this way and things. But I get that fact that there was the work that I think we wanted to do and the work that we felt like we had to do.
Yeah, and it's like those of us, who are still around that can come together sometime and reflect on these things. I think it's been really incredible. What I do know that our work, as someone who's lived with HIV and AIDS diagnosis for like, I think close to 33 years or maybe over 33 years, what always comes back to me is about the community and what are their priorities and listening to them. It's so wonderful to be able to come together with our folks, and talk about what we've learned. And I know from myself, many of the people who identify as long-term survivors in the AIDS movement, they lost all their friends. And for me, I felt like that didn't really happen. I've had a consistent group of people who've mentored and cared about me and lifted me up and pulled me through some really hard times, and I'm very grateful for that. And also we have a national voice now with QTAPI, which we didn't have before. And I remember thinking in the early 90s, like, we are never going to get a national voice. Like, there is just too much diversity in this community and too many strong opinions and too many, but, here it is 20-something years later, and we have that.
Thank you, Steve and Vince, for sharing your reflections with us. Now we turn to Willie Wilkinson. Organizer and writer Willie Wilkinson was the first Asian trans community health outreach worker providing street-based HIV education and crisis intervention for sex workers and drug users in San Francisco. I want to give a content warning for Willie's excerpt as it mentions drug use, sex work, suicide, and houselessness.
Well, I first started working in public health in the late 80s because I responded to an ad looking for a community health outreach worker to San Francisco's Tenderloin. And so my work was to work with everybody who is out there, but primarily injection drug users and also folks who were trading sex for money or goods or services. And so I was really working on just educating people about HIV transmission. So I was really a weirdo. Like in the Asian Thai community, I was just a total weirdo because I was out there working on the streets with the injection drug users and sex workers and knocking on the doors of the massage parlors and becoming the first outreach worker to access women working in massage parlors who were initially saying, oh, no, we don't need condoms. But then as we talked, they'd invite me in and they would accept the condoms and we would talk about HIV prevention and so forth. And so I was working with a lot of trans folks who were out there who primarily trans feminine folks who were doing sex work, whether on the street or in the local bars in the Tenderloin. With the trans sex workers that I worked with, I mean, there was just a certain camaraderie and a sense of a shared experience in a way, although there was much less representation of trans masculine folks in general in the broader society at that time. In the 80s, trans people were pretty much completely disempowered in public health, even though they were beginning to be recognized as a quote unquote target population, which even that language is obnoxious, but a population that was important to provide services for. Trans people did not have positions of power in public health, and very few trans people were employed. I think there was one other trans person. We were pretty much considered the clients, and at a certain point, the subject of study, although there was very little research done on trans people even in the 90s, until we did our landmark study through the San Francisco Department of Public Health in 96 and 97. But basically, trans people were considered to be the folks on the float or the folks who might provide entertainment for the fundraiser and not really get paid well enough. But trans people were not really in positions of power. Now that began to change when we did our landmark study through the San Francisco Department of Public Health, which began as a qualitative study in 1996 and then continued as a large-scale quantitative study in 1997. I was the only transgender person on the team doing qualitative data analysis. And then I was on the community advisory board for the large-scale study, which we did, which at that time was the first participatory action research study done on the transgender community anywhere in the world, as far as I know. And it was the largest scale study of the transgender community anywhere in the world. We needed data that actually told our story from our perspective rather than infantilize transgender people. And so with this study, we did a seroprevalence study, HIV seroprevalence, and it really told much more of the story, what was going on for folks in the community. And it did a good job of sampling people appropriately in terms of the ethnic populations that we make up in the city and county of San Francisco. And it was 1995 that we won discrimination protections in the city and county of San Francisco. And we were the third jurisdiction in the U.S. to get that. And so that was a very powerful time, too, in which I think the community really came together around discrimination protections. And that, I think, really launched the transgender movement in San Francisco. And then from there, we went into really fighting for our rights in public health. And there was, when we looked at the data that we got from that study, and there was a clear association between suicidality and the lack of access to culturally competent care. And so it was really important that we identify what those issues were so that we could educate providers and healthcare institutions about what our needs were. And so it's really powerful to see now that APINC has done this API transgender nonconforming needs assessment that at this point is ethnic specific, though we do have some ethnic specific data over the years with these large national studies that have done, that we have this very specific data now for our community, and that it was done with the participatory action research process that was so empowering to folks in the community.
Willie's insight parallels a conversation between current APINC director Sammy Ablaza-Wills and community organizers Jasmine Hu and Yuan Wang.
I think that our queer and trans API community has grown and shifted dramatically in the last 5 years. And, I think we're best equipped to talk about the Bay Area, of course, and in acknowledgement that there's not one singular QTAPI community, I think the community at APINC specifically has really, really grown, not only in size, but in purpose. 5 years ago, 2015, we were not in the place that we are now, in that I think a lot of folks were still figuring out what their role was within broader movements. I think after especially the passing of marriage equality, there was a lot of momentum in the broader LGBTQ movement lost. And within that, a lot of further invisibilization of queer and trans Asian and Pacific Islander people. So by the time the 2016 election came and devastated communities emotionally and materially and practically in all these ways, I think that was an ignition for a lot of people in our communities to say, we have to rise up and we have to organize and we have to do something with one another, because the emboldened white supremacists of this moment are coming for the people that we love and care about most, and they're coming for us. And so I think after 2016, especially with such an influx of queer and trans API people coming into our work, we had really an opportunity to figure out what to do with so much people power. Like, I remember some of the things we did. We started hosting quarterly potlucks as a way of getting people to just get in the door and get involved. And, you know, previous to hosting these quarterly potlucks, we would have like 25 people at an event, and that felt like a big success. But all of a sudden, we had 70 or 80 people show up at our building and take over all 3 floors of our tiny kind of little building in San Francisco, Chinatown. And we started to see the ways that people wanted to learn, people wanted to grow with one another, but also people were traumatized and scared. And I think that's another really, really important thing to acknowledge, that just because more people were coming to us didn't mean that it was easier. It meant that in many ways there was more dynamics to figure out than when we were just kind of all small and we were all friends and we all knew each other. Suddenly there was a way to participate in quote unquote community work without necessarily being an active community with each other. And I think one of the things that we did at APINC during that time was try to figure out a way for people to connect and build authentic relationships so that they could be genuinely in community with one another, not just in name. So we started to build out a lot of different initiatives. You know, we started the Dragon Fruit Network as a way of connecting people intergenerationally. We started hosting Pop Camp for high school youth to gather from across the nation. When we mobilized in large numbers at Trans March, we wanted to put our narrative out, not just in social media, but in more traditional Asian ethnic media as a way of also representing trans Asian folks in our own communities and in our cultures and in our various languages. And I think that during this time, one of the prominent moments for me in the last 5 years was in 2018, when APINC started a partnership with the Wildfire Project. I think at that time, we were just holding the weight of the past 2 years, you know, especially for myself as a staff person at that time, with my friend Lynn, another staff person at that time. I think there's just a lot of weight put on us to respond, to take in all of the requests of the like dozens and dozens of more people that were suddenly coming to APINC, to figure out what the best way to respond was, all of these different things. And that's a lot of pressure for 2 people. And it's a lot of weight for 2 people to hold. And I think that's what it felt like at that time, to be honest. Like, I'm not sure if it felt so much like a community as it did a group of people loosely affiliated telling some other people what to do. And I think I can say that because it feels in stark contrast to what it is now. And so in 2018, when we brought the Wildfire Project in, it was a really big opportunity for us to look at our organizational practices, at the people in our organization, and name what it looked like when people were not accountable to one another and accountable to the work. We got to name what it felt like to fear things like shame and guilt as a way to be able to release that shame or that guilt. And I think through this really emotional process with the Wildfire Project, we emerged much more rooted in an actual community. We emerged in a way that allowed for people at all different levels of APINC, whether that's the staff people or core, people on our member committees, to people who are just joining as volunteers for the first time, to know that everyone has to take collective responsibility for this organization. And therefore, people have to take collective responsibility for this community. So when I think about some of the biggest shifts in QTAPI community or movement work, I not only think of the practical things, like there's many more people and we're able to focus on things like trans justice and immigrant rights, like all of those things feel like successes. But I'm also thinking about the emotional aspect and the way that people feel responsible for a community, and how that ownership, that feeling of responsibility and purpose, ultimately makes the community more sustainable. And I think that that's been a big success and a big win throughout this past 5 years. Although it doesn't stop being tumultuous, I think we're on a much better path now than we were 5 years ago.
QTAPI organizing as we know it today would not be possible if not for the groundwork laid by our queer and trans elders. So much so that our present knowledge is profoundly informed by the intergenerational connections we initiate and sustain. This next conversation between Tita Ida and Jojo Tai, both activists with resumes too full to list here, is a distillation of what is possible when movements are made in lineage.
Why don't I go first? So, elders first, maybe. I am working currently with the San Francisco Community Health Center, which was formerly known as the EI Wellness Center here in San Francisco. Been around for almost 34 years now, serving. First, we served the API LGBT communities here in San Francisco, and focus on HIV/AIDS prevention, education, and direct services. As many of you all know, HIV has evolved. At one point, it was a death sentence, and now it's a manageable disease. People are living longer productively, and we have to kind of like expand and bring in more folks in not only APIs. So we had to change our name to San Francisco Community Health Center. What I do basically, I oversee our different HIV prevention programs. And I also, since it's a new name and kind of like a new identity, but I've been with them for almost 23 years now. So started out like very young.
Cool. Thank you for sharing, Tita. Yeah. Basically, I'm born and raised in San Francisco. So this city has always been home for me. As you can imagine, San Francisco has been a leader through a lot of different movements and progressions, and especially now with the city being gentrified, as well as the youth population keep on going down and down. Since it's so expensive, a lot of families are being driven out. Mm-hmm. For me, I focus most of my work around youth empowerment and youth leadership. That's what I've been doing since I was 15, 16 years old. Because at that time, I dropped out of high school. I was really disconnected. I was basically just trying to stay out of trouble if I'm not in classroom. And, ever since then, I got connected to different community organizations in the city, like Lyric, the LGBT Center, SF Community Health Center. Those were basically my lifeline for a while, because I wasn't out to my family back then. I didn't have a community to call my own, basically. I always thought the queer and trans community was over there, and I will never be openly a part of that. But ever since then, since I got the support, I saw these amazing leaders, trans leaders like Tita Ida, then I really found myself okay, I could see myself, continuing this work they've been doing before I was even born. And, Tita mentioned I was a commissioner, and from that, I've been really focused on youth homelessness and housing insecurity in San Francisco.
Tita Ida's experience as a trans organizer around HIV/AIDS prevention in the early 1990s paved the way for JoJo and others in creating space for trans and queer youth.
Yeah, the last 5 years, I'm thinking that's when I basically started my journey. Around, community organizing and, all that stuff. What I've noticed lately in the past couple of years, I feel it's more intentional with intergenerational connection, communication. We have to know our history to know where we want to go in the future, basically. You know, I'm very fortunate to be at a place right now where I could definitely see a lot of leaders who are still with me today. Like Tita Ida's not like somewhere far off, you know, like across the country, or like we're two different like timelines, you know, like both here and present, you know, I've been in her car. You know, we've been in many meetings, you know, and I feel like often youth forget like elders are still with us today. We could always reach out. You know, I always want to tell my friends, like, reach out to the older folks in the community, because even though there's so many differences, you know, the way we talk, our vocabulary, our definitions of certain like identities, yeah, it may clash. The heart and the spirit of the community is still there with us, and it still connects with us. And, you know, I'm getting older. When I first met Tita, I was like maybe like 18. I don't know. When I see the younger youth, you know, who are starting in like middle school and high school, like I could definitely see they have their own new creative ways of continuing this movement, continuing doing the work. And that makes me so excited because, you know, this community, the QTAPI community, always be creative and, you know, coming up with new solutions and new ways of organizing.
I'm so happy to see now that we have like folks like Jojo, so many API queer youth who are just doing social justice, you know, being active in the community, creating spaces that are safe for us to all congregate in. It was very scarce before, like whenever there are new youth programs for API queers that comes out, I mean, it was very much celebrated. We were always making sure that we put them on high in the spotlight because they're the future. At the time when I became kind of like really very active, I realized to myself at that time, I was in my late 20s, that pretty soon I'll be 30, pretty soon I'll be in the 40s and then 50s. Who's going to continue this work? Because there's a unique spark, I think, when youth in general starts creating change. It's great to see it's being continued.
Although our demands for justice parallel that of what our ancestors fought for, we organize and mobilize within an ever-changing political, social, and cultural landscape. The following content mentions anti-blackness and police violence, which may be upsetting for some listeners. This brings us to the present, 2020. In the wake of COVID, the institutional war against Black lives is ongoing and heavy on our minds. In May 2020, global protests took place following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Nina Pop, and countless others. From Minneapolis to Louisville and back home in Oakland, nationwide Black-led protests were met yet again with a highly militarized response from the state. What took place in the summer of 2020 marks 7 years since the Black Lives Matter movement emerged. Today, it may feel like nothing has changed, and it may feel like we are continuously caught in these cycles of violence, death, and outrage. We know that when we talk about movement work in this episode, we have to address anti-Blackness and confront the racism that persists in our Asian and Pacific Islander communities. The work of affirming, celebrating, and fighting for Black lives undoubtedly influences the perspectives and actions we take up within movement work. For this reflection, we invited Mika and Claudia Leung, as they have served as organizing members of Asians for Black Lives, a Bay Area-based Pan-Asian organized collective that strategizes and supports the safety, justice, and resilience of Black communities via solidarity and direct actions. Mika brings us into this headspace as they share their reflections around the events of summer 2020.
I don't know. I think I'm also just sitting with the heaviness that today is September 23rd, 2020, and it was the day that we heard that there would be no indictment of Breonna Taylor's killers. And as someone who is an abolitionist and doesn't believe in cops and the carceral system and the criminal justice system in general, like I also am just holding the complexity of what this grief is, and as a non-Black person trying to just witness grief right now, that there was no real indictment, and that at the same time these systems were never made to actually support or protect or find justice for our folks. And it's the evening now, and I'm in downtown Oakland, California, and I'm thinking about the fact that it's going to be probably a really loud night in downtown Oakland, or maybe it's not. I don't know, but that there's just something about this exact moment in the past 5 years that it feels like, again, people have been showing up and doing movement work and making these realities known for a long time, but there's something like I don't know if this night would have been possible, and the conversations that were going to be had in the next few months would be possible if it hadn't been for the previous years of like really pushing and organizing and what's happened this summer. So I don't know, that feels pretty rambly because it's like really fresh on my heart. But it feels important. Again, like a 5-year chunk, and thinking about these past 5 years is really, it feels like, I don't know, some kind of like energetic thing for me that is really striking.
Listening back to what Mika has to say, there is so much to hold and take in with their words. The significance of this summer's uprisings is heavy, but it's necessary to have challenging and honest conversations about anti-Blackness. As we're reflecting on our own histories, we know that our successes and transformations could not have been realized without Black-led movements for Black and trans liberation. There's a hidden history of LGBTQ activism that is inextricably tied to and led by trans and Black changemakers. Take for a fact that the LGBTQ movement in the United States didn't start with the 1969 Stonewall Uprising. In 1966, 3 years before Stonewall, a group of trans women and drag queens fought back against police violence at Compton's cafeteria in San Francisco's Tenderloin. While not all of those present at Compton's were Black and trans, a group of Black trans women today are leading an effort to establish the world's first legally recognized transgender district at the site of the riots. The organizers, Honey Mahogany, Janetta Johnson, and Arya Saeed, wanted the district to honor the first documented trans and queer uprising in the United States and serve as a safe space for trans people to access community resources. We would like to take a moment to recognize and express gratitude for those who paved the way before us, for the Black folks who lived at the intersections of trans, queer, houseless, poor, for what they fought for, even when their movement saw them as singular. In our conversation with current A-Pink staff, we turn back to Sammy, who discusses how A-Pink is centering anti-racist work and encouraging its member base to take on the responsibility of dismantling anti-Blackness.
One of the things that A-Pink holds as a truth for us is that it is everyone's responsibility to address and dismantle anti-Blackness. And I think it's no accident that so much of our own movement history has been either framed by or deeply embedded in or connected to so many of the Black-led movements that have transformed the so-called United States. And, I think even about how much the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement influenced the literal creation of the Asian American movement, to thinking about even fast forward to 2014, how the Black Lives Matter movement really, really activated so many young Asian American folks and Pacific Islander folks to get involved and to see that there is systemic injustice embedded into the DNA of this country. And so when I think of the ways that our work is in concert with all of that learning and how the work of Black organizers has informed queer and trans API folks, I think for us, it is such a reminder that we have to be critical and we have to be cognizant of the systemic injustices. And that is where we need to put our attention to do real and transformative work. I think in the past few years, there's been a rise in what some people are calling boba liberalism. It is this idea that, like Asian American folks, like all they care about is representation and having people not hate on their food. And while like those might be important issues for some people, I think what Black-led uprisings and movements have taught us is that it is more critical, more timely, and more pressing to actually figure out what is the root cause of the injustices in this country and to tackle those straight on, whether that means taking time in our own groups to unlearn anti-Blackness and discuss what that looks like, or whether that looks like just showing up and putting our bodies on the line when Black organizers ask us to because of the relative privileges that we have, whether that means educating our own communities and talking to folks about things like prison abolition or defunding and abolishing the police. All of those things are in our wheelhouse of responsibility, and it has to take a collective effort. And I think if we're moving away from something like boba liberalism, which I think the movement for Black Lives has encouraged a lot of young Asian people to do, it allows us to look at the connections between things like the prison industrial complex and immigration detention centers. It encourages us to look at the militarism of the police in the United States and connect it to the militarism that brought colonialism and imperialism to many of the countries that we come from. I think it encourages us to take a hard look at how this country has perpetuated war on its people here and has exported war to many of the countries and communities that we call home or homeland. And I think it's my hope that having those things in conversation allow us to be not only allies, but co-conspirators by having those conversations and recognizing those truths and putting ourselves on the line and not only examining our own conversation to it or our own, like how close we are, our approximate position within that conversation, but to actually take ownership of the fact that we have to change what we do. We have to change how we think to be able to support in the transformation of this nation from being rooted in anti-Blackness to being proactively pro-Black.
Why is it critical for us to bring this analysis back to our own communities and our own lives? What have we as non-Black people been complicit in? And how do we move up as conspirators? How can we do better? Returning to our conversation with Mika Hernandez and Claudia Liang, Claudia explores her lessons learned from the movement for Black liberation and the cyclical nature of movement organizing.
And I also recall seeing something on Instagram earlier today that was like mentioning that 65 years ago today, to the day, was the day that Emmett Till's murderers were acquitted of their charges and were allowed to walk free. And, September 23rd, 1955, that's way more than 5 years ago. And I can feel myself having one response to that, which is like, oh my gosh, nothing's changed and we're still fighting the same fight. And I think that that's a really common response and also like definitely a valid response for people who feel frustrated and upset and angry that this kind of thing is still happening. I don't think you can discount the efforts that have been put in over those many years and all of the wins that we've had and all of the wins that this broader movement has had. The movement for Black Lives, like that, the phrase Black Lives Matter was coined in 2013, but the movement for Black liberation has been going on, like Mika was saying, for centuries. Yeah, just looking at the last 5 years, I think it is really easy, especially under this current presidential administration, to feel really like everything is really doom and gloom. And yet, when you look at history, and if you're a student of history and you're looking at sort of these broad strokes of, I like to talk about dialectics. I know it's like kind of academic, but like the idea that, when something happens, it's sort of like for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And then those two things the thesis and the antithesis come together, and they make a new reality, a new synthesis. And I think that is the work of long-term movement work. I mean, it's recognizing that you're going to have amazing, incredible wins. And I think, in a lot of ways, for me at least, the uprisings earlier this summer felt really amazing and empowering and like just inspiring to see so many people, like 50,000 people on the streets of LA. You know that those are not all day-to-day organizers. Those are not all people who are doing this kind of work every day, but that was like a mass movement, and that was really inspiring. And then you also have days where you're going to have really tremendous feelings of loss. And I think today is that kind of day for a lot of people. So, I think if you want to try to be in movement work for a long time, for more than 5 years, having that view, having the understanding of history, and having the understanding of how there is a cyclical nature, but it's not just cyclical. It's not like you're just repeating or retracing your steps. I actually like to think of it as a spiral more than a circle. I don't know, like I'm a visual thinker, so I'm like, I like to imagine that we're going up on the spiral instead of spiraling down, because spiraling can also be a word that is used to mean sinking deeper into a bad place. But yeah, like I think, it's a spiral, like we're coming back around to a similar point, but we're not in exactly the same point. Like there's resonance, there's echoes of something we've experienced or seen before, like with Emmett Till, and now with Breonna Taylor. But it's also that things have shifted, and we are in a different place than we were back then. And I think just it's the constant work of assessing that and assessing how to respond appropriately given the conditions of that moment.
Claudia, thank you for naming the impact of long-term movement work. How can we reframe our present outlook, even when it feels like crisis upon crisis? How can we reframe now as a new synthesis to be referred to as our histories 5, 10, 20, 50 years down the line? Organizers Tita Ida and Jojo Tai emphasize the impact of storytelling and reflect on their relationship across generations.
Well, I think I've always believed that storytelling has a very unique power of bringing people together. It's important for us to try to understand everybody around us, because there will always be a time when assumptions. I don't like making assumptions. For me, it's really, we're creating history for the future generation. One thing I've learned is that when I hear stories from folks who are older than me, I tell myself, wow, I've been through that, and it's so important that I'm validated, my experiences are validated, and my thoughts, my feelings, especially, that someone kind of like went through that similarly, and how can I make it better for the next generation by telling my story, by talking to, amazing people like you all, and having people listen to this, hopefully.
Yeah, there's something so poetic and beautiful, hearing people tell their stories, because they tell it through their own eyes and through what they were feeling and experiencing themselves and the emotions they were holding. And, I hope with this conversation, I'm so honored to have this conversation with you, Tita. I don't know if because I always tell everyone, like, oh my God, Tita is so amazing. I really view her as like a mentor, She's like, I hope to be like as strong as a leader as her one day when I'm older. I don't say that to her often because I don't want her head to become too big.
You say you still have to help me clean the storage for Pence March.
Yeah. Yeah, I say that now, but then she tells me to clean up, like fetch her something, go to Costco or something.
But no, that's so nice of you, Joe, to say. And for me, it's always also an honor, because we had a youth program at the agency, and wow, I was blown away at that time when I would hear how they talk, and I learned so much. Like I felt so obsolete. Like I was like, oh, I didn't know that was that was possible, and all those things. So it was just amazing. I think the generations complement each other, and it's so important to always honor that. It's always so important. If you can't honor it, at least respect it, and give it its breathing space so that others can also absorb it.
We got to preserve our queer story and honor our ancestors,
As you've taken the time to listen to how people see themselves in the lineage of movement work, we also want you to explore how you fit into this bigger history. How do you situate yourself in the events mentioned in this episode? What is your relationship to movement work now, and where do you want that relationship to go? Thank you for listening to the Dragon Fruit podcast, and special thanks to the storytellers who shared their stories and histories. This episode was made possible by the following team: our writers and editors Shilpa Rao, Ankur Patel, Ralph Leonio Atanasio, Dorothy Tang, Emlyn and Isabella Rustin, our podcast volunteers, APING staff members Sammy Ablaza Wells, Yuan Wang, Jasmine Hu, and StoryCorps. Our opening theme music was produced by Sax Religious. You can also find our podcast episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and www.apienc.org. Thanks for listening to this episode on movement work, and stay tuned for our next episode on relationships.